Is Russia a good fit as a strategic economic partner for South Africa? To answer that question, Beyond Markets spoke to independent strategy advisor Sean Hagedorn to get his input on this partnership.
So in terms of what strategic partners line up well in terms of complementing each other, it's really hard to imagine where there are good advantages between Russia and South Africa. They have a lot of similarities. They're much more natural competitors, and there's almost no case to be made that they're good strategic partners.
Well, can you just, would I call it describe, or just talk us through South Africa's international integration strategy?
South Africa currently seems to see itself as one of the BRICS nations, and there's an interesting mix there, with China being by far the dominant player, but obviously India is very large as well, and Brazil, and Russia, and South Africa. And South Africa really needs to export value-added goods and services, and none of those countries are natural partners. I mean, most of the purchasing power in the world today is still in the West, in Europe and North America. And then Asia obviously is making great progress. But for the most part, Asians continue to buy things from Asians, and then they buy raw materials to build infrastructure. And so that's very important to South Africa. But South Africa, like Russia, needs to diversify away from that. So in a way, Russia and South Africa are looking at each other, they're both looking in the wrong direction.
Interesting. Now, in as much as we're talking South Africa-Russia relations here, or any other country really, how appealing is South Africa right now to potential partners?
One of the things that the countries really like when they're choosing a strategic partner is complementary needs, and then another thing is consistency. And at the moment, South Africa has forever been seen primarily as an exporter of extracted minerals. And now South Africa has to change. And so South Africa has to build a new economic model. It needs to diversify away from its traditional model. So in a way, it's just inherently inconsistent. So right away, you have really quite a big challenge.
Yeah, interesting. Then now, when talking about this relationship, what sectors do you think would mutually benefit if both nations come together?
In effect, South Africa, like all extraction-based economies, they're price takers, and you basically just respond to international demand for whatever commodity it is you export. And so now the big transition that South Africa and a lot of really all extraction-based economies need to focus on now is where are there segments where they can sell value-added goods and services, and that whole dimension is changing radically. I mean, people talk about globalization as shorthand for trade imbalances. But the bigger factors going on in the background is we're shifting from an industrial-led growth global economy to a services sector-led growth economy globally. And so South Africa, as well as all of the other extraction-based economies, need to respond to that. And it's happening just in the space of a couple of years. And just something that happened last week, which I thought was very notable, Apple, which is the largest company in the world by market capitalization, they've now pledged, they don't know how they're going to do it or when they're going to do it, but they are taking mining out of their supply chain. They're only going to build products with recycled materials. And that's really a big shift.
Now, you wrote that, or noted rather, that Russia has an eye on South Africa's power sector. Care to talk us through this? What are we talking about here now? What's the focus on? Nuclear?
The other thing that comes in is it's just big time delays. In terms of getting the policies right from either country's perspective, the longer delays, the more it serves as a distraction politically and economically. But it's just as like Apple is saying that it's going to take mining out of its supply chain, and that's a very aggressive statement. Really what's happening is that there are more and more alternatives to traditional forms of energy, whether it's hydrocarbons or nuclear. And so as you have those time delays, the more you stretch out the whole rollout of your new source of power, the greater the level of uncertainty, and in all likelihood, the more competitive renewable forms of energy are going to be.
But, still on this matter, what do you make of South Africa investing in nuclear reactors? What do you make of this whole discussion?
Well, first off, the biggest point, and I can't emphasize this enough, is where you can now see after the downgrade of South Africa's credit rating to junk status by two of the big agencies, that now virtually all the economists have reduced substantially their growth rates for South Africa for the let's say next 3 years. And you can look back over 7 years, you can see we're now going to have a 10-year period, a decade of really no growth in per capita income. So in once countries go into prolonged stagnation, and there's no, like after 3 years, it's not obvious why the South Africa's economy is going to be able to turn the corner. And so once an economy is entered a phase of prolonged stagnation, first off, you have to ask, well, what are the power needs going to be? You're not going to have to add a whole lot of power, and energy is accounting for less and less of economic growth than what it has in the past. To increase GDP by 2%, you don't need to increase energy consumption by 2% like you used to in the past. So you put all those things together, and it's getting harder and harder to make the case for nuclear.
Now, how would you describe or analyze Russia's strategy in Africa?
Rather than speak directly to that, Russia's strategy towards the West is what really is up in the air now. Over the last 2 or 3 years, since the price of oil has declined sharply, and Russia annexing Crimea, basically Russia has had to figure out how it's going to deal with sanctions from the West, and so to look to Africa to kind of make up for the shortfall by selling sort of nuclear power technology. That's a pretty aggressive move that is pretty hard to justify. I mean, first off, these long time delays, whether it's sensible, and even if everything were to fall in place, you run the risk also that South Africa, quite frankly, if it doesn't turn the corner, can't pay for the nuclear reactors. And then you have similar scenarios across Africa, because so much of the economies of African nations are based on extraction of either hydrocarbons or minerals.
Now, in what ways would you like to see South Africa relate with Russia?
They have a lot in common, and so they're associated with in the BRICS forum, and maybe there is something positive there. But what is remarkable is how their challenges are very similar, and the leaders, quite frankly, Zuma and Putin, they're both very shrewd political operators, and neither of which has an economic model which is at all promising at the moment. So in a way, they can kind of put their heads together and say, it's time to have a serious rethink, and at least they have someone to talk to with a similar set.
So let's do a bit of comparison here. How would you, if we're comparing South Africa's relationship with the U.S. and South Africa's relationship with China compared to South Africa's relationship with Russia, how would you describe it?
Right. Okay, so there's a really interesting set of countries that you've just chosen, because economists use the word autarky, which means a country could really operate independently. And if you were to choose the 4 in the world that have the most potential, it's probably those 4. But the world is very interconnected, and the world's changing very rapidly. And most of the growth currently is coming from China and the U.S. And then you have the natural resource suppliers like Russia and South Africa. And the big picture is that countries like South Africa and Russia, all politics aside, they have very, very serious economic structural problems. And there's really no way around countries that need to grow having to find ways, just like at individual level, for people who have lower incomes, you need to develop more skills and more ways of adding value for people who have greater purchasing power, people who have greater skills, greater income. And that's the big challenge. And we're going through just a massive transition. So, so Russia is being held back now by sanctions by the West, which are really biting. They're very severe. And the damage will last for many, many years. And South Africa kind of has a self-imposed sanctions against itself because its policies tend to, in many cases, be anti-Western. It would rather do business with the BRICS nations.
And that was Independent Strategy Advisor Sean Hagedorn.